This is the Triratna Dharma training course for Mitras. Compiled by Vedanya and produced by Sangaruchi. Music by Sarvadarshin. Hello, my name's Sangaruchi. This course is usually offered in Triratna Buddhist centres to small groups. I'm producing an audio version for anyone who can't get to a centre. Please listen to episode 1.1.0 as this gives an introduction. The course is narrated in text sessions, and in a subsequent question and answer session, I respond to anything people have sent me. Do send any questions. One point 1.3 The Buddha, the goal of Buddhism. Questions and answers. First question is, what is duality? So it says in the text that some schools go so far as to say that in this state of awareness, in the state of enlightenment, the subject-object duality is no longer experienced. There is no out there, no in here. That distinction, that subject-object distinction, as we usually call it, is entirely transcended. So I can't answer this from direct experience. I can possibly give some ways in which I have conceptualized it, or I wouldn't say that the experience of non-duality is completely devoid from my experience, because I think I have some idea of where to look, or inklings of that experience, or to some degree at times. So first of all, experientially, if wherever you're sat, you bring your attention to the experience of sitting down. I presume you're sitting down or standing up. Now, whatever you're in contact with, the cushion, you have an idea that you, that is your bum, is sat on other, which is the seat or the cushion. So self has come into contact with other, and there's an experience that arises from it. Now, bring your attention to that experience, and can you separate your bum from the seat? Not as an idea, but as a lived experience. Can you discern one from the other? Can you say neatly where the you in that experience ends and the other in that experience starts? And so experientially, in an embodied way, you can't really do that. In terms of biology, that works as well, because if you look at something, you say that the thing that you are looking at is other, but actually the thing that you're looking at, that you understand, is movements, electrical signals in your brain. So it's not quite clear what is self and what is other in that sense either. In a materialist sense, if you're looking at it from a materialistic viewpoint, there are atoms in self and there are atoms in other, and those atoms don't know which is which. There's nowhere written on an atom of you the word self, and there's nowhere written on an atom of the table other. There is nothing objective about reality that is self or other. And so what these all point to is that the designations of self and other, although they look to us like they are realities, although from our point of view we believe there is an in here, which is the subject, and an out there, which is not the subject, they are in fact designations. And we can see this because you have, in certain situations, you might be born with a penis and you might decide that that is not self, that is not me. You might have a strong response to that. So that's a physical part of your body which you can either identify with or not identify with. There's emotion as well. So you might get angry and you might not know why you're angry and feel like these emotions are taking you over. You might identify with it and say, I am angry, or you might not identify with it and you say, this anger has got me caught up in this situation. And likewise, volition. There's a fairly unusual condition called alien hand syndrome, where it's a part of your body that behaves completely separately to your conscious mind. And in some situations, people actually have that part of their body amputated. They don't identify with it. Any of the movements that are happening in that hand, they say are not me. And then adversely, you can imbue things outside of yourself or outside of your physical form as self. So if you really identify with a loved one, a partner, a child, if somebody insults them, so somebody is insulting other, because that's not you, that's a different person, but you will behave as if you are personally insulted. It goes into you because your sense of self has gone beyond your own skin and become part of them. Ideas too. There are certain ideas that we will die for, that we think are more valuable than ourselves, and whether that's religious or whether that's liberal or fascist ideas, whatever it happens to be, we can hold something as being more essential to our identity and self than our physical body or how we feel or our own safety. And you can also take it in the opposite direction. So imagine yourself at the least enlightened moment of your life, when you were experiencing the most suffering, when you were most reactive, when you had least love, when you had the greatest amount of hatred and closeness to the world. And if you think of that time, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I would imagine that there would be a very, very strong, hard line between me and you. There would be you against the world, or maybe against a particular person, but there would be a very clear me, and I am this side, and there's you or other or the world or the other group or those people who are threatening me or doing wrong to me or whatever it happens to be, and there would be no overlap. It would be an absolute hard line between the two. And so the more that non-duality comes in, the more that we can see that hard line between self and other, between me and my experience and you and your experience, the more that line starts to become less rigid, less fortified, I think is probably a good word. And what we're talking about here is love, really. I think non-duality is the philosophical, heady word for love, metta. When you naturally love someone, you will find that if they are concerned about something, you will be concerned about something. Their concerns become your own. Their interests you find, even though you're not interested in it, you'll actually become naturally interested in it because they are interested in it. And so this breaking down of the barriers between self and other is why Buddha is motivated to do things. Because in the absence of greed and in the absence of hatred, which is the traditional way that we see an enlightened mind, you could imagine that the Buddha would just sit under a tree, completely contented, and do nothing until the day he died. Because if you don't have any greed and you don't have any hatred, there's nothing to motivate you. There's no will, there's no reason to get up in the morning, there's nothing to drive you. A Buddha in and of themselves is experiencing no suffering, is experiencing no pain, so they don't need to get out of bed for themselves. But because his concern, or her concern, extends equally to all other beings, they're acutely in tune with other people's suffering and other people's joy as if it were their own. The fact that I might love somebody doesn't mean that I experience physical pain in them in exactly the same way that I experience in myself. There is some necessary and practical division between the degree to which I can sense my own experience and the degree that I can sense someone else's experience. But from an enlightened point of view, my own experience is not fundamentally different to anybody else's, which unfortunately, from a worldly point of view, we nearly always see our own concerns as more important than everybody else's. So that's non-duality, which I think in experience is better described as love. Is enlightenment an ever-progressing state or an end goal? An ever-progressing state would mean that the word enlightenment would be written with a small e. You would be becoming more and more enlightened, but there would never be a state at which you were enlightened. It's just a process of continual unfoldment that has no particular end. So this is just like learning a subject. There's not really any end to a particular subject. You can keep discovering more. You can keep going into more detail. You can keep getting better at a sport. However small those increments might be, you can keep going. Now, I think that's a valid way of looking at it. I think there are pros and cons to that. I think if you are a particularly willful person who's always trying to get to an end goal, always trying to achieve something, I think that way of approaching enlightenment can avoid triggering that characteristic. And that might be useful. There's another way of viewing it in that enlightenment is a particular state of mind that you're trying to get to. It's defined, it's clear. Once you get to it, the work has been done. The advantage of that, I would say, is that for people who are quite willful and want to get to an end goal, it does trigger that inclination in you. And actually that inclination can be very useful. It's got a lot of energy in it. If you want to meditate every single day for a year, setting that as a goal that you're going to be proud of and that you will achieve at the end of the year if that gets you to meditate, that's not a bad use of will, to be fair. There will probably be some consequences to using the will, but it does get you on the seat. So I think both of these have a validity. From a canonical point of view, the Buddha was pretty clear about it. It is an end goal. That's the way that he described it. But the end goal, in this sense, I don't think is a static place. It's not like you become enlightened and then you just stop. In some ways, becoming enlightened is the part at which you start getting going. He described enlightenment as casting off chains. So in that way, you could actually see it the other way around, in that the end goal is the point at which you're free to move and to act and to engage with the world. Everything before enlightenment is static. You're actually tethered and limited by your own narrow-minded understanding of what you are, who you are, your habits, and your distorted thinking. Another conception is by Sangharakshita, who has suggested that enlightenment is a little bit like the furthest horizon. So if you're at any point on the earth, you look around you and you can see the horizon in all directions, and there's someone stood on the horizon. That's the point of enlightenment. The furthest point you can see, that's your conception of enlightenment. Now, of course, if you actually walked all the way to the horizon, a new horizon would come in front of you. So from that metaphor, you could say that you do reach enlightenment, because from where you stood when you started practicing, you look out, that point there, when you get to it, is enlightenment. And so you can reach enlightenment. It is a particular place. You could also argue that you never reach enlightenment, because it keeps moving. These are just ways of viewing the ideal. And I would say try both, actually. You'll find that one is more appealing to you, and you might want to major with that one if there's more energy in it. But I'd say becoming familiar with the other one, and at times acting on the other one, may be challenging to you in a different way. Maybe try both. I think probably having an experience of both and seeing what the consequences of both of those approaches are is useful. Really, what makes the difference is what is going to get you to make the next step. There is one way that I thought of that integrates both of these conceptions of enlightenment, whether it is an ever progressive state or an end goal. Practicing is a little bit like you're a baby, and at first you can't walk at all. All you know is that people around you seem to be able to do something that you can't, and it seems to benefit them. And you engage with them, and you look at them, and you watch them for a while. You still can't do it, but then you try, and you completely fail, and you fall over. But then the next day you try it again, and you try it again, and you try it again. And after a little while, you manage to stand for maybe a second. If you're around a load of people who have your interests at heart, they'll see what you're trying to do, and they will try and support you, and they will say, that's fantastic. They'll encourage you more. Now, enlightenment is a little bit like having learnt to walk. Your skill actually increases by a very small amount each time. Now, there's a certain point after maybe 6 months where you can kind of walk, and you can stumble around, but you often fall down. And that's a great point to be at compared to the start. But there's a certain point at which you can walk and you never fall down. You never fall off that point of balance. You can always stay up. Now, that is not a static state. Standing, if you ever just stand there, in fact, it's a lovely thing to do, stand there and meditate, your body is continually adapting to the situation. So it's not a static point. Learning to walk is not a static thing. It's a skill which is totally dynamic. Everything is involved in that. All your senses are involved. Walking is not a thing you achieve, it's a skill that you can do. It's also a very defined point at which you can fully walk. I can fully walk now. I don't have to think about it. It just happens. I don't need to tell my feet what to do, and they just do it. And not only that, but I couldn't actually fall over and hurt myself if I tried now. I couldn't throw myself on the floor and break my arm, even if I willed myself to do it. It's not actually possible. In the same way that if you're enlightened, you can't act unethically. You can't intentionally harm anyone. You can't become unmindful. You can't cast away your sense of compassion. There's something innate in you, which is a skill in you, which is so well developed and serves you so well and serves the people around you so well that it's now self-sustaining and doesn't stop. But with that said, even though there's a point at which you can always walk whenever you want, which is a really defined and important moment in your life, you can always get better at it. You can always develop that further. But to a baby, if you're a baby looking at someone who walks, you probably wouldn't be able to tell whether that person is only just skilled enough to walk or whether they are a marathon runner. You kind of wouldn't know. Like, that wouldn't be a level of understanding that you could comprehend. The bottom line is they're both free. And that's sustainable. It doesn't drop from them. Does enlightenment require effort or letting go? So in some ways, I would say that this is probably one of the most important aspects of practice. It would be it's kind of quite complex to answer, because exactly what does effort or letting go mean? Letting go in this situation doesn't necessarily mean blobbing out. Like, intentionally watching Netflix for 6 hours is not really letting go in a Buddhist sense. And effort of forcing yourself to stay in contact with the breath, or ignoring the fact that you're dominating one part of yourself with another, that's not effort either. I'd say it requires both effort and letting go in the same way as a jazz musician is completely free and effortless and just enjoying what's happening. They're not conforming to any particular music or having to play in any particular way. It just flows out of them. But if you, assuming you're not a jazz musician, if you sat down to do that, you just holding a saxophone and letting go is not enough to do that. You couldn't do what they were doing by just letting go. A jazz musician needs to apply themselves with incredible dedication and discipline continually for a long period of time. And so the two are required. A little bit like breathing in and breathing out. You can't have just breathing in and you can't have just breathing out. You actually need to engage with these in an intelligent and in a harmonious way. If you only breathe in, you die. If you only breathe out, you die. If you only exert effort in your practice, it's not going to go anywhere. Likewise, if you only let go, it's not going to go anywhere. The Buddha was actually talking with a musician, about practice, and this guy was making a lot of very willed effort, and he said, the lute that you use, when do the strings harmonize? When they're too tight, or when they're too loose, or when they have the right measure of tightness and looseness? And of course the answer was when they have the right measure, when they're all in harmony, when they're neither too tight nor too loose. The general sort of populist approach to Buddhism is that it's all about letting go, man. It's all just about chilling out. When you look on Buddhist Center websites, you'll see pictures of flowers and nice sunsets and what are those? The dandelion clocks with the little seeds floating through the air. It's all very light, airy, and easy, I'd say. It's all very non-threatening. It's all very relaxed. Quite beautiful. And that's definitely a part of practice. That's an essential part of practice. I think that's come into populist culture because we can have quite a Protestant work ethic in the West, which is you must work to be worthy. Even a sort of self-flagellating thing of anyone who's not pulling their weight. Ideally, you should be working all the time, and then you'll be righteous, and ideally you should not be enjoying it. There's not really any place for that, I don't think, in Buddhism. But I don't think going to the other extreme is the answer either. So does enlightenment require effort or letting go? I would say almost certainly requires both, and at different stages. It's not necessarily that it requires half of one and half of the other. Really, the bottom line is what is required to bring you into a more intimate relationship with reality, with the directness of your lived experience. And sometimes that might mean effort and dedication and commitment, and actually going into dangerous places and looking at things that threaten you or are painful or require some will to keep yourself in a place that you want to get away from. At other times it means not controlling, not pedaling, taking your hands off the steering wheel and seeing what arises. Next question. The text says that the enlightened man is higher than the gods. I thought that Buddhism was non-theistic. So this is a curious peculiarity. The word gods, usually it's a translation of the word Deva. There's various other words like yaksha and other various spirits. Those words can be translated as gods, they can be translated as spirits, they can be translated as sort of ghosts or anything like that. There's a whole pantheon of different beings in traditional Buddhism. At times the Buddha was said to convene with these spirits. Some of them are the spirits of trees or the spirits of ponds. Some of them are very powerful beings that have considerable influence over worldly affairs. Now, how you engage with that, whether you psychologize that, and again, in what we were talking about before, those forces that are at play, those characters that arise in experience, if you designate them as self, you will psychologize them. If you designate them as other, you will put them into a pantheon of spirits or gods or whatever it happens to be. But either way, there are forces at play which we can get into, which we make narratives around and which we get into dialogue in some sense with. And some of us may be more fluent in that language or not. And we may use more psychological or more supernatural worldviews to engage with them. Whatever the reality of that is, the most important thing is that in Buddhism, the Buddha did not acknowledge the existence of a creator God, largely because there are 3 marks of conditioned existence, which we'll get onto in later weeks, but all things are impermanent, all things are insubstantial, which means that nothing makes itself, and all things are unsatisfactory. Now, a creator God would be permanent. They would be substantial in that they would have no prior condition. They would have just arisen. They would just be. They wouldn't have become from something else. And presumably they would have whatever experience that they wanted if they were the creator of all things. So the 3 fundamental tenets of Buddhism don't deny the existence of spirits, but the spirits would be impermanent. They would be insubstantial, and their experience would be unsatisfactory. So any spirits that exist, any gods or devas or whatever it happens to be, they must conform to the same fundamental laws as all living beings, as all the rest of the universe. The existence of devas is a traditional Buddhist view. I don't believe that you have to hold that view for the Dharma to make sense. I think you'll probably have to engage with that worldview enough for you to become familiar with it, particularly if you're looking at the Pali scriptures. But I do find for myself, so this is talking, I'm going to start talking about myself and my own engagement with this. I started off as entirely materialistic, and I found that an entirely materialistic view in that consciousness is a byproduct of material form, of atoms, and that's all it is. I found that to be uninspiring for my imagination. And the degree to which I've found the imagination as a more potent faculty than reason means that I have become much more loose around that view. I think reason is quite useful for safeguarding your views. So I think if you really come down to it, you can protect yourself against crazy ideas that God told me to blow someone up or something like that. I think you can limit your imagination with reason. And I think there's a safety factor in that because it prevents you from going really badly wrong or really badly become very harmful and detrimental to your spiritual development with your imagination. But I think it also limits the upper capability of that in that it can severely limit your imagination from giving you access to other states of mind. And I think if you want to experience different states of mind and to broaden your horizons in what you are and what your consciousness is, I think a rigid materialistic view is very unhelpful with that. I think you can hold a materialistic view, but I think a rigid materialistic view is psychologically limiting. The next question is, what is the divine I? So the text says, according to one of the oldest accounts, at that time he, which is the Buddha, looked out over the world, over the whole of humanity with his spiritual vision, or what he called his divine eye. And in this situation, he saw lotuses at different stages of development as a metaphor for humanity. My sense is that his divine eye is his imagination. But I think when we talk about the imagination in most situations, we are belittling an experience. We say, oh, you just imagined it, which essentially means that it's nonsense. Often the way that we use our imagination, it will be the imagination that is driven by the poisons, driven by the kleshas, which are greed, hatred, and ignorance. So it's the imagination co-opted by greed, in which case it will be a sexual fantasy, or it will be a fantasy of getting what you want. It will be co-opted with hatred, which is where you're telling your boss where to stick it, or you're having that argument with somebody and they say really stupid things and you always say a thing that catches them out, and you'll show them who they are and you'll win. Or it's ignorance, which is just either a general fog of random, not very cohesive thoughts that have much meaning, or a thing that's linked to ignorance is delusion, which is where you tell yourself that things are not the way that they are to avoid the reality of the situation. And so that would be the imagination co-opted by unenlightened faculties. But one can use the imagination in another way, which is where the imagination is informed or energized or orchestrated by the opposite of the poisons, which is love, which is generosity, and which is wisdom. And so in that situation, when somebody comes to you and they say, well, they tell you about their experience, you resonate with that experience. Empathy is the imagination. I mean, what is it? I mean, you can't directly perceive what their experience is. That's not really possible. But if you're wise and aware and you're kind and you're generous with your time and attention, the imagination is not a thing that you say, oh, you just imagined it, that's nonsense. The imagination is actually putting you more in contact with a greater sphere of what reality is. And so the imagination in itself is a neutral faculty. It's not nonsense, nor is it wise. It's just a mode of perceiving things that are not directly in your field of view. That's all it is. And so when that imagination is completely orchestrated by positive functions, it becomes a very, very powerful method of empathizing, understanding, being moved by the experience of others, becoming educated by the experience of others, engaging with things that are outside of your immediate lived experience that can be a huge asset, because there's a lot of experience out there that would be really useful if you could tap into, and really enlightening and really eye-opening if you could tap into. And so the divine eye, I would say, is that. You could say that it's your imagination, but really it's the imagination of a Buddha. It's an imagination that is purely there to see truth. It's not an imagination that is there to hide the truth. And that is a very different kind of imagination from the kind that we understand. If you were in a state of enlightenment, how is it not possible to get upset about things such as war and killing? I realise that you are accepting that things are as they are, or that it is reality, but how would you cease to be upset by it? So the first thing about this question that's quite curious is that I don't know what your approach to this is, because there are some people who come to Buddhism and they like the idea of not being affected by the things around them. When they turn up, they say, "Yeah, I want to learn to meditate so I can switch off. I want to stop thinking. I want to have time out. I want to sit and meditate." Because they look at people who are meditating and they think, well, you're not moving, you're not crying, you're not running around doing things, you're not really shouting about an opinion. Therefore, you obviously don't experience anything. And for people who are looking to not have an experience, to completely turn off, a bottle of wine is better than meditation. The most intense experiences of my life are in meditation. No doubt about it. Like, by a damn long shot. Meditation turns the volume up on life. And likewise, you could be asking this question from the other side, because some people come to Buddhism and they have an idea that Buddhism is not caring about anything. They hear about detachment and things, and they don't want to be engaged in Buddhism because they think, I don't want to lose my concern for the world. Or it could be that you're just asking this as a practical point and this isn't personally relevant either way, or that you're neutral to it. I don't know. And I don't know which you are. And if I knew, it would probably change my response quite considerably depending on which angle you were coming from. But I'm going to give it a go anyway. Maybe try and address both. If your position is that you want to get away from the suffering of the world, and that your conception of enlightenment is that it's like a grey and neutral desert island in isolation from all things, then I'd say you might be in for a shock. After he become enlightened, the first thing the Buddha did, well, he did all sorts of, there's quite a curious process that happens after that, with several imaginative, allegorical, or just practical things that he did. One of the first things that he did was look out with the divine eye, look out with his illumined imagination. And he took into his mind all the joys and all the sorrows of all living creatures without exception. And he said this was the anukampa, and the anukampa is it means shaking. He took this experience of living beings into his core so deeply that his body shook with the consequence of that. He said it's a little bit like when you pull one string on an instrument, even if you haven't plucked them, the other strings vibrate as well. He said it was like that. It was these strings, these experiences happening all around him, and he shook. He resonated. His heart shook with that experience. So, if you think that enlightenment is a distant or neutral experience, according to the Buddha, that is not the case. He was intimately bound and dedicated to all life in the universe. He had a profound solidarity with life. Now, What's curious about this is, he welcomed in an entire universe of murder, starvation, sexual abuse, unrelenting disease and poverty, old age, sickness and death, child mortality, enslavement and butchering of animals and people. He accepted that the way that it was. That's probably easy for people to do on an intellectual level, but that is utterly incomprehensible for people to do on an emotional or on an empathic level. The weight of that is incomprehensible to us, and it would actually, the weight of that would probably destroy you, either immediately or fairly quickly afterwards. You couldn't handle it. It seems to be that we identify with limitations. We identify with a self, and we bound our experience within a notion of self. We can't even handle our own experience, let alone a universe of experience. And so we have it's a little bit like we have this little cup that we have as the self, and we put our life, we put experience like water. We fill that cup up with experience, and we can only handle a small amount. And when it goes over a certain amount, when the intensity of our life gets too much, or the pain, or the change, or just anything, actually, even the joy, when it gets too much, it spills out over the top of the cup, and we make a mess. We lose our awareness. We become disorientated. We sort of go a little bit out of control. We don't know what the hell's going on. And so when we have an experience that is bigger than the self, it overflows and we can't handle it. But the Buddha didn't confine his experience to a cup. The Buddha was he's the ocean. There isn't a way of making the ocean overflow. The ocean effortlessly becomes as big as necessary. And so you don't become upset, you don't overflow. So that's a sort of image that might be helpful. I don't know. There's another point of view which you could be coming from, which is around the idea of enlightenment, or the ideal of enlightenment, being very unattractive, because if you truly accepted everything, you would no longer be horrified. You would no longer be angry. You would no longer maybe have a sort of sense of righteousness about what needed to be done, or even a sense of hatred or impatience that is needed to, I don't know, burn down the abattoir, or, whatever it happens to be, whatever your cause is. The concern around this is either the Buddha doesn't feel anything and he's not bothered, or, as we've just talked about in terms of this ocean, that he's able to hold it all and accept it all and doesn't need to do anything. There's a view in there that the only way that you can act is through a sense of anger, or through the negative emotions that you hate a particular political cause is what motivates you to do something about it, or that you are horrified at somebody's actions. It's only that intensity and that conviction that can drive you to respond in a way that is strong enough to meet what's needed. But there's another aspect to acceptance which might help with this. When we talk about accepting reality, we nearly always talk about it from the receptive pole. And it's nearly always outside of you, so that you accept all the suffering and then you just sit still. But the Buddha didn't sit still. In fact, he walked the entire length of the Ganges basin twice every year, all the way up and all the way down. And that's not on nice roads. And he did that whilst there was tigers and malaria about. The Buddha, although often depicted as being sat on his arse, probably a good portion of his life was walking. He was going out to people. And so part of accepting reality is also accepting your karmic capacity. That is, karma means action. Accepting your ability to enact change. And he did, in a very, very serious way that was so serious that we still know his name 2,500 years later. A good portion of the world is made very different because of what he did and who he was and how he acted. Acceptance is accepting the given situation for what it is, and it's accepting that you have responsibility as an active agent in the world. It's not clear to me which one is more difficult to accept, actually. The two together is, it completes the circle, let's say. It's empowering. And that's not complete responsibility. You don't have absolute control over the situation. So it's accepting both your capacity for responsibility and the limitations of your capacity. That you can't make other people think differently. Or more to the point, you probably can make and force people to think differently, but if you were ever enacting that, you would almost certainly be part of the problem. There's a few other things around this which I might be able to speak from personal experience. So I used to be very much into activism, particularly around animal welfare. The initial thing was that I wanted to do something for the welfare of animals. I ended up going to a Huntington Life Sciences rally, and the police were everywhere. They were pretty pushy. They had horses there, and the horse is like a big wall. It just moves around, and you just don't mess with it. And I saw an animal activist lob a brick at a policeman on a horse. And it landed just short of the horse, but it could have hit the horse. And I remember thinking, something's really not right here. This has strayed from an active expression of a positive vision to hatred of an opposing vision. I backed off it pretty quickly. But that wasn't really the complete story, because that left me for some time without an expression for that value that I had. I mean, the activism was not a perfect expression of that, but at least it was an expression. And I went some time being very self-righteous and militant with my family. And of course, they didn't want to hear that, and they didn't really care, and it was just a bit awkward, actually. But I wanted to enact some kind of change in the world. Fast forward a few years, and I come into contact with Buddhism, and I start helping out at classes, introductory courses. Now, in the introductory courses, vegetarianism wasn't, I mean, the word vegetarian might have been featured once or twice. It wasn't, you don't have to be a vegetarian to be Buddhist. You certainly take on ethical precepts, but where you are on that and how you fulfill them is questionable by people if you've made a public declaration that you'll do that, but it's not defined. And so really we weren't banging on about vegetarianism, but as it worked out, if people stay at the Buddhist Centre for a reasonable period of time, they generally start to make more ethical decisions because they start to believe more fully that love is more conducive to their happiness and the happiness of everybody around them than anything else. And so, I think more people become vegetarian and vegan, and more animal suffering has been averted through 1 hour at a introductory course, helping out an introductory course, than an hour at a protest. I'm confident of that. And not only that, everyone's all right with it. You're preaching to people who actually want to hear and are up for making a change. And it's actually addressing the problem at the deepest possible level. It's addressing the source of suffering. It's not addressing the consequence of suffering. Now, that's not to say that I believe that all activism or all protests or anything like that are not valid. I am definitely not saying that. But certainly for me in this instance, it was a radical change in how I approached the problem of suffering. And it wasn't long after that that I started to see why getting involved in pretty violent action was appealing. There was something in me that said that if I'm psychologically destabilized by the suffering of others, I'm wrecked by the suffering, means I'm morally good. And I think that's a questionable view now. I think running yourself dry turns you into a martyr. And I think everybody who sees you working on that cause begins to associate misery with that cause. And I don't think that helps the cause. It helps my own self-righteousness, but it doesn't help the cause. I identified as a victim. I believed myself as a victim. And I wasn't willing to look at that pain. And so if I can save all other victims in the world, I would somehow save myself. If I can't resolve my own suffering, I'm not really effectively going to be able to resolve other people's suffering, or other animals' suffering in this case. How this relates to enlightenment, I'm not quite sure. I've rambled a bit, but I suppose the main points are: a Buddha's experience is not a grey neutrality. Practice doesn't reduce the amount of experience in your life. The aim of practice is to increase the mind or the heart or the cup that's placed in. So you've got a greater capacity to hold it. And that capacity is limitless. The other thing was, accepting reality is not just accepting a given experience, it's accepting your agency and the limits of your agency. The other thing is that a Buddhist practice is a training in responding to a problem at the deepest possible level, at the source, which is the mind. But that doesn't prevent you from addressing it at other levels in the meantime. You may choose to do direct action, or you may choose not to do direct action as a consequence of a reflection or a change in your mind. And both of those could be valid expressions of Buddhist ethics. Whether you vote conservative or liberal, whether you voted for Brexit or not, all of those could be an expression of Buddhist ethics. Anyway, that was a bit meandering, but I hope that's helpful.